The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Stability is often underrated, but tonight we've got two stories that highlight why its reverse, namely collapse, would be very much worse. First, we'll find out how vital the Gulf Stream is to maintaining global weather systems and why there is concern that climate change could upend it. Then, writer and national security professor Tom Nichols explains why he's concerned that the biggest threat to democracy might well come from the people themselves. It's Monday, September 27th, and that's all ahead on the agenda. We've seen plenty of extreme weather events this year. Those would look like a walk in the park, apparently, if climate change led to a disruption of the Gulf Stream. Experts are keeping a close watch on that, and we are joined now by three of them. In Victoria, British Columbia, Brad DeYoung is a professor of physics and physical oceanography at Newfoundland and Labrador's Memorial University. In Vancouver, BC, Stephanie Waterman, professor of earth and atmospheric sciences at UBC. And in Midtown, in Ontario's provincial capital, Kent Moore, professor of atmospheric physics at UTM, that's University of Toronto, Mississauga. And we're grateful to have the three of you on TVO tonight for a discussion I must confess I have not seen or heard much about, which is all the more important a reason why we should do it here tonight. And just to set this up, let me read this excerpt from the New York Times about the Gulf Stream system. The Times says it is one of the mightiest rivers you will never see, carrying some 30 times more water than all the world's freshwater rivers combined. In the North Atlantic, one arm of the Gulf Stream breaks towards Iceland, transporting vast amounts of warmth far northward, by one estimate supplying Scandinavia with heat equivalent to 78,000 times its current energy use. Without this current, a heat pump on a planetary scale, scientists believe that great swaths of the world might look quite different. Let's dive into this. Stephanie, how would you characterize the importance of the Gulf Stream for our climate and weather and our world as we know it?
Yeah, well, I think New York Times article does express how important it is. So the Gulf Stream is one of the ocean's main ways of transporting heat from lower latitudes up to higher latitudes. So we get a lot more energy from the sun near the equator and a lot less at the poles. And the role of this heat transport is to spread some of that heat out, and it lets the climate at more northerly latitudes be a lot warmer than they would otherwise be. Very important for climate dynamics.
Kent, what would you add to that in terms of our truly understanding the significance of this Gulf Stream?
Well, anyone who's visited, let's say, the UK and then has gone to Labrador, they're about the same latitude. So you'd expect them to have similar sorts of climates. The average temperature in northern Scotland is about 10 degrees Celsius, and the average temperature in Labrador is below zero. So you can just see the kind of huge impact that heat has. It makes wide swaths of northern Europe much more habitable than they would be if, in fact, the Gulf Stream wasn't transporting that heat northwards.
And just follow up, if you would, why does it seem to get short shrift? I talked to a number of people about this, and they didn't know about this.
Go ahead, Brad.
You know, we've only really known the Gulf Stream was there for about, a little more than 200 years. It was Benjamin Franklin who first mapped it out. He was the Postmaster General for the New England colonies, and he mapped out how quick ships would transit back and forth to the colonies from Britain, and found that there was this strong current there, and then showed how ships could use it going back and forth. But since having kind of discovered that, I think our general perception is that the Gulf Stream is a persistent feature of the ocean and unlikely to change. I think that's how all of us see the world around us, that, you know, it's there. Of course, it's going to be there tomorrow, and it's not going to change. But the other part of it is the Gulf Stream is tied to a kind of complex wind pattern that spins the water around the Atlantic basin. And I think even a lot of scientists felt that this wind pattern really wasn't likely to change very much, and that therefore, you know, it should be pretty reliable. It turns out it may not be as reliable as we had thought.
Well, Brad, I want you to, while you have the floor, pick up the story with something, again, that I had not heard of before, called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. AMOC. AMOC. What is that?
Okay, I feel like we should be on Sesame Street. We should have, Big Bird or something, and explaining how to pronounce meridional, which just really means north-south transport. And this whole AMOC discussion is tied to what Stephanie described, the role of the Gulf Stream, which is just one part of that circulation. And the Gulf Stream is carrying warm water to the poles. So if you think about it for a bit, if we're pushing a bunch of warm water to the pole, then either the poles are getting filled up with water or there's some return flow somewhere else. And what happens is there's cold water that sinks underneath the warm water and spreads southward towards the equator and then through the global oceans. And it's that movement of the warm water south at the surface and then the cold water underneath it that's the bigger picture, the AMOC. So the Gulf Stream's role is the surface heat transport. The rest of the transport is underneath in the deep ocean. And so this is the way in which this climate control system that we have, the warm water moving northward and the cold water moving southward, controls or adjusts our climate, and why it's so important if it got disrupted that the climate around for the rest of us who live in the atmosphere, for those of us who live in the atmosphere, would be messed up.
Now, Kent, I think we have a bit of a video presentation here that may further reflect what we just heard. So I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to roll that video, please. And Kent, as we watch it, maybe just describe what we're seeing.
Sure. So this is an animation from NASA. And so what you see here now is the warm water moving northwards up into that area where it's kind of dark. That's the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift. And then now as they zoom in, what you can see now are these arrows are descending. And that's when the warm water moves northwards, it's losing heat and moisture to the atmosphere. That water becomes dense and it sinks in a process that we call convection. It's exactly the same process that occurs in a pot of water. The only difference in the ocean is that the convection is upside down. So essentially the heavy water sinks to the bottom instead of warm air rising, which happens in the atmosphere. So that's what's happening. And so that loss of heat and moisture at high northern latitudes is really crucial, because if that doesn't happen, then as Brad said, the Gulf Stream can't transport heat any more water northwards. It has to kind of weaken or shift southwards.
Now, Stephanie, in terms of comprehending the vastness and sheer sort of size and power of this thing, well, let me put it this way. Astronomers often talk about how difficult it is for our brains to really comprehend, the vastness of the universe. Do we have that same problem as it relates to the vastness of the Gulf Stream?
I think so. I think the scales of the Gulf Stream, for example, and many of the features in the ocean are planetary scales, and they're much larger than the ones we're used to dealing with. The dimensions of the Gulf Stream, the width of this stream of water and its depth varies along its path, but it can be up to 100 kilometers wide, and it can extend through the whole ocean depth, so up to 4,000 meters tall. Someone once told me the transport of the Gulf Stream in terms of, in the context of an army, how many soldiers walking by per second. And so the transport, we measure the volume transport in millions of meters cubed per second, and it's equivalent to about 750,000 100-kilometer soldiers marching by every minute. So the scales of this transport, are much larger than the things we interact with, on a day-to-day basis.
Well, we got a hint of it in that first NASA animation, but then Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up that second shot as well. And this is a picture of the ocean circulation system. And again, it may give some indication what Stephanie was just talking about. This thing is, it's vast. And Stephanie, do you want to just take us through this graphic image briefly and suggest, well, it is massive. It goes everywhere. It's all over the world, isn't it?
Yeah, so this picture shows you the global scale of this overturning circulation. And some people call this depiction, the conveyor belt depiction of this overturning. And so the red colors here that's the surface flow that we see on the upper limb of this overturning circulation. And we see, as Brad described, how the deep cold waters, which are in blue here, spread down from the North Atlantic, but that's then spread everywhere around the global ocean before rising up and becoming the upper level, or the orange part of this conveyor belt. And so this picture is a really good picture of how the scale of this current is global.
Gotcha. Okay, Brad,
and
let's
I might
go
add
back.
that the time scale, if you think about the time scale for that circulation, it's up towards 1,000 years. So it's a really large, really slow-moving current, but it could take 1,000 years for water to complete that cycle.
Take 1,000 years for water to make one cycle, the likes of which we just saw on that map.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in which case, okay, can you take us back then to the previous ice age and what we learned about what happened to the Gulf Stream at that time?
Okay, so about 12,000 years ago, when the Earth was warming up from the last ice age, the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada, was melting, and it was sending huge amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic. And so there was a period of time which paleoclimatologists call the Younger Dryas event. Dryas is an alpine flower that usually grows in very cold regions, and they found pollen of this flower regions where it shouldn't be. And so that was the first evidence that there was this cooling. It lasted about 1,000 years. So for about 1,000 years, Europe suddenly went into a deep freeze. Temperatures in Europe probably dropped by about 10 degrees Celsius, probably in a lifetime. So this is something that would have happened sort of in someone's lifetime. And so Europe got really, really cold. And then eventually, over time, that fresh water was mixed away, and the Gulf Stream was able to resume. So what's important about the fresh water is that to get that sinking happening, as you saw in that video, you need to have the water really dense. And if the water is very, very fresh, that means that it's much harder for it to sink. And if it's harder for it to sink, then you can't transport as much heat northwards. So during the after the last ice age, when the Earth was warming up, Europe went into a deep freeze for about 1,000 years or so. And that's, if you like, the kind of most dramatic example of what we might see happening if the Gulf Stream weakens.
Well, that's where I was going to pick up the story. Brad, what's the significance of that revelation in terms of practical application today?
Well, the key issue is that, when you think back to those images where you saw heat being released in the Labrador Sea or in the Greenland Sea, warming the atmosphere there, that would stop happening. And so the weather patterns in the Northern Hemisphere would be enormously disrupted. For the moment, we're talking about how awful it would be if it was a total collapse. I don't think, even though that's in the discussion at the moment, that's the most likely thing to happen in the century we're in, but it's not utterly impossible either. And so basically the weather in the Northern Hemisphere would be nothing like we presently see. It would be a much colder, likely drier system. Storm patterns would change hugely. Ice conditions in the Northern Atlantic would all look very different. And so not just the Atlantic, because this influences the whole planet, but so the whole weather system of the Northern Hemisphere would be significantly disrupted. But for the moment, I don't think that's the most likely outcome. This idea partly has been in the scientific discussion as a serious consideration for several decades. And so there have actually been science programs going out to try to measure what's going on, because there was concern, partly from people experimenting with numerical models where they kind of dropped some fresh water at the surface and said, what's going to happen to this circulation? And what they discovered was even small amounts of fresh water could lead to significant changes. What Kent described in Younger Dryas, this event of a long time ago, was an enormous inflow of fresh water, we think, that caused this shutdown. But models have showed that even a smallish amount of fresh water could have a really big influence.
Let us read the following excerpt. This is from a study this past August by Nicholas Boers from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, who warns of, quote, early warning signs for a potential collapse. We're asking the question, could the Gulf Stream collapse, or a shutdown of the AMOC, which we talked about earlier? And here's what Nicholas Boers writes. He says, the signs of destabilization being visible already is something that I would not have expected and that I find scary. It's one of those events that should not happen, and we should try all that we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible. This is a system we don't want to mess with. All right, let's follow up from that. Stephanie, maybe start with this. When we talk about could the Gulf Stream collapse, physically speaking, actually speaking, when we use the word collapse, that would refer to what?
Well, as Brad said, there's different scenarios that could happen. Collapse, I think, suggests that the Gulf Stream is no longer transporting that water and that heat from the equator to the pole in the way it does today. I think there's a spectrum of things that could happen. That transport could slow down a lot, or it could cease. Collapse suggests cease. And so if that heat transport shut down, there would be knock-on effects in the ocean circulation and also the atmospheric circulation, that are complex and interconnected.
And Kent, how concerned do you think we should be about a potential slowdown or even shutdown of the Gulf Stream today?
Well, as Brad mentioned, we've been measuring the transport since about 2004. And over that period of time, we have measurements that show that the transport is decreased by about 10%. So that's a pretty significant decrease. Of course, with only a 16-year record and a cycle which has a timescale of hundreds or thousands of years, it's really hard to infer much from that. But I think it's one of these events we should be concerned about a potential slowdown, because that, again, would have knock-on effects, not as dramatic, of course, as if you collapsed it. But I think it's in the realm of possibility in the next century that we'll see this slowdown continuing. And, we'll see incremental cooling in, let's say, Northern Europe, even though the Earth is warming up. And again, changes to ocean circulation across the whole globe. So I think we should be worried about it. The collapse, I don't think will happen in anyone's lifetime. But I think we should be concerned about a slowdown.
And just to follow up on this, Kent, if the world is getting warmer, and we don't want that to happen because climate change is not a good thing for this world, and we'd like the temperature rises not to take place, but this has an influence of making the world cooler. Can you help me with this? Do these things cancel each other out?
Well, that's a good question. And I think people often think of the climate system as being a linear system. That is, the Earth warms up, the Earth cools down. But of course, it doesn't. There's parts that warm more rapidly. For instance, the Arctic is warming much more rapidly than the rest of the Earth. And so it's a nonlinear system. And so we could be in a situation, as we were in the Younger Dryas event, where a period the Earth was warming up after the last ice age, Europe went into a deep freeze. So it's possible to have these transient sort of events happen. Eventually, it'll work its way out, but it could be the case. And so the climate system is nonlinear, and there's a concern that we may be reaching what's called a tipping point, where there's sort of two states. And that's what Nicholas showed in his papers, that the Gulf Stream exists in either a very kind of rapid state, which we're in now, and then a very less rapid state. And so what Nicholas was talking about is this transition or tipping point where you suddenly transition from one state where the Gulf Stream is very active into another state where the Gulf Stream isn't as active.
Brad, any thought about what would happen to Canada under such circumstances?
Well, I mean, let me first go back to your earlier question about, is this a good idea? Because I'll just give you a kind of a counterexample to that in some sense. And that is, about 100 years ago, there was a proposal that a barrier, a dike, be placed across the Grand Banks of Newfoundland to stop the flow of this cold water that we showed moving southward. And the idea was this would warm the New England states, that the United States would have a much balmier climate and all would be good. And this was actually a serious suggestion made by one of the lead engineers for the Panama Canal. And it's under that category of, we now can control the Earth. And I think the idea that we get to control or to, control the temperature of the Earth the way you do your house with a thermostat is not a very good suggestion, because there are lots of unintended results of that. And so while this might appear to cool appropriately portions of the planet, it also utterly disrupts the whole kind of climate system, weather system within which we operate. And there would be very unhappy consequences for lots of people. So to your second question around how it would influence Canada, I mean, it would dramatically, obviously, most influence Atlantic Canada, since we're, bordering the Atlantic Ocean, and we're clearly seeing a major disruption of the temperature and the conditions which we would see there, which would also disrupt fish stocks and shipping and all sorts of other things. But for Canada as a whole, it would shift the potential for agricultural activity across the country, change precipitation patterns hugely. And so it would not just be a little disruption. So what we've seen so far in the changes in weather, I would categorize relative to what we're talking about now as a small disruption. This would be a major disruption of weather. Weather would look nothing like it's looked in the last 100 years.
Stephanie, let me put this quote to you. And again, I may need some help with the pronunciation here. Scientist by the name of, it's either Wallace Broecker or Brecker?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Okay. He developed the idea, apparently, of a global conveyor belt linking the circulation of the global ocean. And his quote is, "The climate system is an angry beast, and we are poking it with sticks." How do you like that as an analogy for what's going on right now?
Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't say angry. A complicated, complex, vast, interconnected in ways that some ways we understand and other ways we don't understand. Poking it with a stick, I think, is maybe appropriate in that I don't think we have a full understanding of how perturbations to one part of the climate system will impact all these other interconnected systems in the ocean and in the atmosphere, in the biosphere. And so, so I think that the poking with a stick is sort of a reference to we are altering the system and suggesting alterations perhaps through geoengineering. But we don't, they're very crude, these tools, and we don't, and the beast part, we don't understand the complexity of the response of that. Angry is a bit emotive, but complex, yes.
A little too much anthropomorphizing there maybe on his part, but put it this way, the suggestion certainly seems to be that we are poking with a giant stick, and we're doing so not having a good enough understanding of the outcomes that we may be responsible for. I mean, is that a fair observation, Stephanie?
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. We appreciate the complexity, but we don't understand all the interconnections and the complexity. So understanding the knock-on effects of actions, I think most climate scientists would feel that we don't have a good understanding of all those knock-on effects.
Okay. Kent, let me try this. Everybody seems to think of climate change as a very gradual thing that will take place, 2 degrees over a several decade period of time. But then you referred to a tipping point earlier, and I wonder whether this effect that we're talking about, all of a sudden, it's like the house of cards falling down. You can do a little bit and nothing much happens, and then boom. Is that potential here?
I think that's the concern. I think it's safe to characterize global warming as mostly linear. I mean, we're just warming the planet up. But then we can have these knock-on effects where suddenly there's a big transition. And the one I like to think of is just freezing. Like in Toronto in the winter, our temperature's around 0, right? When it's -2, everything is frozen. When it's +2, everything gets slushy and you get splashed by cars, as you walk down the street. And so there's an example of a tipping point where water melts at 0 degrees. And so if you go through that point, you suddenly have a very different climate system. And that's, I think, a sort of metaphor maybe for what a tipping point is, one of these sudden changes that happens because the system is highly nonlinear. that means that the responses may not be the same as the inputs. And I think that's really the concern. The Gulf Stream is probably the poster child, if you like, for these tipping points. But there's other ones. Losing Arctic sea ice is another one. We have a dramatic transition. Losing land glaciers. There again, these are really dramatic changes. So the Gulf Stream is probably the most dramatic of these. But the climate system is full of these nonlinearities that could, if you like, bite us if we poke too hard.
Brad, if the Gulf Stream system were to weaken, or God forbid, even shut down, is there anything at that point that could be done about it?
Well, that takes us into this kind of category of trying to, instead of poking at the bear or the angry animal, to throw a net over it or something to try to contain it. And, if you go back to our description of how enormous the Gulf Stream is, that's a pretty big animal to throw a net over. And so the suggestions for geoengineering, the responses to these problems have so far not looked more appealing than the problems themselves. And so I think the short response is no, not likely. And it's really why I think in this broader discussion about climate change and putting CO2 into the atmosphere, there's a lot of focus on trying to stop us reaching a particular temperature change, 1.5, whatever, 2 degrees. We don't want to get to that point. But what this discussion shows is there isn't an absolute point where we need to worry about things like this. These things could happen, this kind of tipping point, somewhere along the line of from where we are now to those 1.5 or 2 degree temperature changes. So anything we do that slows down or stops us from reaching those points is a good thing, even if we only get to 1.4 or 1.6, because just thinking of Kent's analogy, if the tipping point is at 1.9, then we for sure don't want to reach that point. The problem is we don't know where these tipping points are in the system. We know they're there. We know that we're close to them because the whole system is basically, hasn't really changed substantially. And so the tipping points aren't far away, that we're certain of. And so the question we don't know the answer to is, how far away are they? And at what point when we poke at this bear or whatever animal, is it a bear? Something else. At what point does it get really upset and tip over? And the less we poke, the less CO2 we put into the atmosphere, the better.
And Stephanie, just finally, is there a preferred geoengineering solution here that scientists are somewhat in agreement on?
Yeah, well, I liked when Brad said that those solutions don't look more attractive than the problems we're facing right now. I think there are some ideas out there, but I don't think that any of them have been deemed feasible or have been tested. And again, the knockoff effects of perturbing the system, I think, cause scientists a lot of concern. And so I wouldn't say that there's a geoengineering solution out there that I feel confident in at all.
Kent, how about you? Last word to you on this issue. I guess we've all agreed it's a bear. We've all agreed we shouldn't poke the bear. But is there a geoengineering solution out there, notwithstanding?
I don't think so. And as Stephanie mentioned, that every one of them has some problem. The scale is enormous. I mean, just think of how much energy is in the Gulf Stream, right? It's just enormous. The other concern I have is that it diverts us from the real pressing issue, which is getting our carbon emissions under control, right? If there's this magic bullet that we can suddenly put a big sail up in space and reflect sunlight, back out in space, it detracts us from the real problem, which is we need to get our carbon emissions under control. And that's really the only way that we can contain the warming and make sure that we don't reach these tipping points. So no, I'm not in favor of any of these geoengineering solutions. They're all have unanticipated consequences. There's a huge record of us trying to do things and screwing it up, right? I mean, that's what we do as humans, and I think this is another example of a way that we would probably mess things up even worse than what we were trying to solve for. So no, I don't think it's a feasible solution.
So note to self, don't poke the bear. We got it. I want to thank the three of you for joining us from near and far tonight for a really fascinating discussion. Stephanie Waterman in Vancouver, British Columbia, Brad DeYoung in Victoria, BC, Kent Moore from UTM in Midtown Toronto. Stephanie, I'm sure it's been observed by many in the past. You do have the perfect last name for the kind of work that you ended up in, right?
It's true.
I mean, come on. For an Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences person to have a last name Waterman, I mean, come on, give me a break. Well, there we go. Thanks, you three. Be well.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You, Steve.
We the people. That is, of course, how the Constitution of the longest-standing democratic republic in the world begins. But in the turmoil of the last few years in the United States, author Tom Nichols argues in his new book that the people are currently part of the problem. The book is called Our Own Worst Enemy: The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. He's a columnist for USA Today, a professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and Tom Nichols joins us now from Middletown, Rhode Island for more. Tom, it's good to have you on the program again. How are you doing?
Good, Steve. Good to see you again.
Pleasure to have you on. Now, we had you on in 2017 to discuss your last book, The Death of Expertise, about the growing distrust of experts in too many parts of your country. Did writing that book inevitably lead to this one?
I wouldn't say inevitably, but it was sort of haunting me in the background, because the problem that I talk about in this book is to some extent the same problem that was sort of lurking underneath the book about knowledge and experts and why people won't listen to them. And in fact, I even mentioned in the previous book that I thought perhaps a pandemic might snap people out of it, and it didn't. And that problem is narcissism, that we have become an affluent, we in the developed world, in the United States especially, but in other countries as well, we've become an affluent, narcissistic, self-centered society, and you can't sustain a democracy on narcissism and self-centeredness.
Before we dive into that thesis more, I did want to ask you about the tone of this book compared to the last one. It seemed to me in the last book that your tone was more one of, well, more that you were saddened. You were saddened about the fact that America, so much of America doesn't appreciate the value of expertise. But in this book, you seem, if I may say, Tom, you seem downright angry and are much more furious about America's descent into stupidity, or a lot of it's anyway. Have I got that right?
Angry, and it's also, there's a certain amount of, I think, pain in the book, because it's autobiographical in places. I talk about my own upbringing and growing up in a factory town in Massachusetts. And it's a combination of anger and frustration and exasperation and a painful realization that this democracy that has lasted over 2 centuries is being endangered, not by foreign enemies, not by a Great Depression, not by a cataclysm or a natural disaster, but simply by stubbornness and childishness and a kind of resentful sense that, no one is the boss of you, which then bleeds into really, uncivic and at times dangerous behavior.
You do lay much of the blame for the rise of illiberalism and this distrust of elites at the feet of the people themselves. What is the likelihood, don't take this the wrong way, Tom, but what is the likelihood that you, a university professor and author, are the right messenger to send this message to that group of folks?
I wrestled with this in the book because I'm a university professor now, but I grew up in a very working class, gritty neighborhood. My parents were not educated people. They were high school dropouts. We had, as I point out in the book, we suffered through a lot of the dysfunctions that afflict working class families back in the 1960s and 70s, including financial trouble and alcoholism and violence and all the things that happen to normal families in bad times. And in fact, at one point, I wondered, have I been part of the problem at both ends of my life? Was I part of the problem coming up as a young man in those days? I mean, I was as likely as a young teenager to go to jail as I was to go to college. And then later in my life. So I hope I'm the right messenger, because I've lived, I've made that transition from one group to another, from one class to another. And I hope that I have a little bit of distance on it. But I don't know that anyone's the right messenger for it, because it's very hard to turn to your fellow citizens and say, maybe you're the problem. Maybe it isn't globalization. Maybe it isn't Jeff Bezos. Maybe it isn't the Chinese. Maybe the problem with our democracy is right here in front of us in the mirror. And that's never a pleasant thing to have to say to anybody.
Let's do an excerpt from the book. This is from Our Own Worst Enemy by Tom Nichols. Authoritarian systems are the authors of their own troubles and deserve every molecule of the opposition they face from within. But why are people who are already free, and who are by any relative measure materially and politically better off than in those more repressive states, attacking their own systems of government? The answers are as disturbing as they are counterintuitive. We are losing because we won. We are suffering because we are successful. We are unhappy because we have what we want. Now, obviously, that is not the message that we've become accustomed to hearing over the last 5 years, particularly since Donald Trump arrived on the scene. What are you seeing that so many others apparently are not seeing?
One thing I did in the book was to try to take a longer view than just the last 5 years. I mean, Donald Trump is this kind of black hole that warps all of the light around it. I think people on both the right and the left have a tendency to focus on Trump as some unique phenomenon. I tried to take a longer view of this over about 40 or 50 years and across countries. Remember, this attack on democracy is not unique to the United States. It's happening in Italy. It's happening in the UK. It's happening in Turkey, in Poland, in Hungary, in Brazil, in India. And I think that this is paradoxically because of peace and prosperity. Democracies can cope with almost any challenge except boredom. And in the book, I talk a bit about the prophetic voices that saw this coming. Christopher Lasch saw this coming when he talked about narcissism in 1979. But even further back, Eric Hoffer warned that in a book called The True Believer, that I think people need to start reading again as well, that when you have a middle class that's bored out of its mind, you are ripe for a mass movement, because people have this need to feel some sort of meaning in their life, and so they want to go and invent great crusades. Part of that is to convince people, and part of the reason, Steve, I think that when you say this is not the message we've had over the past 5 years, we've developed a political culture in a lot of countries that is constantly premised on telling the voters that things are the worst they've ever been. These are the worst times ever. No one has ever suffered like you. No one has ever seen the kind of deprivations you're living in. And of course, this is nonsense. This is just, in most times in history, it's been nonsense. But certainly in the early 21st century, it's nonsense on stilts. But, nobody runs for election by saying, everyone's doing well, but we could do better. My opponent is a good person, but I think I can do a better job. You don't motivate people that way, and you certainly don't motivate them through social media that way. And so we've created a culture that says you are a victim. The world has screwed you over. Everything is terrible, and someone is to blame. And if you elect me, I'll hurt those other people, and I'll get even on your behalf. And again, you cannot sustain a democracy on that kind of behavior. You just can't.
Well, it doesn't, let me suggest it doesn't have to be all of one or all of the other in order for there to be a grain of pushback against what you're talking about. For example, it's also what you just said is an empirically provable fact. The times in which we live, in many ways, have never been better for the most number of people. Having said that, globalization did shut down a lot of towns in Middle America, and there are drug problems as a result, and a lot of economic gains have been felt by the Jeff Bezoses of the world as opposed to more evenly felt across society. I mean, surely much of that is true, and much of that is a factor for the unrest in your country today, no?
There are two problems with that. First of all, as I point out in the book, having come from one of those towns, much of that deindustrial damage was actually done 30, 40, 50 years ago. And there's a point in the book where I'm talking to a friend from my hometown who points and he says, I remember when those factories were full. And I said, that's impossible. You can't possibly remember that. because when we were kids, those factories were already mostly empty. And so I talk a lot in the book about the lure of nostalgia. And so there's this assumption that, again, the data does not bear out, that somehow globalization in the past 10 years just emptied out all of these towns. The other problem with that thesis is the very poorest, at least in America, are not the people rebelling against democracy. As I say in the book, poverty, drug abuse, the undeniable impact of globalization, both good and bad, because I think the other problem is that we've decided globalization is just always bad, even though you and I are using it right now to have this discussion, we've come to somehow believe that all of this happened 10 minutes ago, but the people that are actually suffering from that are not the people that are attacking democracy. One of the things you find in the United States, as well as in Italy and the UK and other places, the most illiberal elements are middle-aged, middle-class people who are actually fairly well off. The people that attacked the US Capitol were not unemployed steelworkers. They were professional. They were accountants, dentists, real estate agents. Some of them chartered private flights to go there. This is what happens when you get a bored middle class that is fed a steady diet of propaganda about how they are the downtrodden and most aggrieved people in the world. It's such a great story to say that democracy is in trouble because the very poorest are rising up into the streets. But that's not what's actually happening. It's not what's happening in most of these countries. These are political entrepreneurs goading the middle class into believing that somehow they've been victimized. You know, again, a story I tell in the book of, you know, a good friend who high school diploma, you know, kind of like me, he grew up in a financially, economically insecure town and on the edge of poor. And he literally is telling me about how much he thinks the world is unfair while he's sitting on his boat. That's the society we've created, where middle-aged men sitting on boats think that they are victimized somehow. And so while all of the issues you mentioned, Steve, they're real problems, but that's an argument for better policy, not for destroying democracy.
No, in fact, I do remember while watching the insurrection on your Capitol on the 6th of January earlier this year, I do remember thinking, boy, some of these folks are awfully well dressed. Well, they must have borrowed the clothes. Some of these folks have got awfully impressive wire cutters or equipment or building scaling
body armor,
devices.
Camo.
Exactly, all of that stuff. And then when I read about all of that in your book, I thought, okay, maybe there's a little more to this story than meets the eye. So yeah, okay, I'm happy you put that on the record.
It's expensive to be an insurrectionist. You know, it takes an outlay of some serious cash to do that.
As we saw, yes, indeed. Let's talk about the chapter in your book that you devote to a study of a rural Italian community in the 1950s. And in helping understand what that was all about, may tell us a bit about today. Can you pick up that story for us?
Sure. You know, every student of politics, culture, anthropology, sociology, politics, this was a standard work that all of us had to read for years by an author named Edward Banfield. And Banfield was a New Dealer who got disillusioned with central planning and couldn't figure out why, despite all this government help, farms in the United States, farmers wouldn't cooperate with each other. And he goes to the University of Chicago and he kind of works on this as a problem. And then he goes to Italy. And that's when it occurs to him that the problem with development is not in the institutions or the laws or the policies that you can pass, but that you don't get very far with any of that if people simply won't cooperate with each other. And what he found in this Italian village was that development, and he was mostly writing about poverty, not democracy, but it turned out to be a study of democracy, that if you only care about yourself and your immediate relatives, you know, your children and yourself, that you actually end up poorer and worse off than if you were part of a community that volunteers, that you work together, you engage in honest commercial relations with each other, and so on. And I resurrected this book, not just because it's a classic in the genre, but because I want people to understand we are de-evolving as a democracy. We are literally moving backwards away from a very civic society, the kind that we know in North America, in the United States, and Canada, that Banfield, this professor, thought so highly of. We are actually going backward toward becoming like this Italian village in the 1950s. And I did that because as I was watching a lot of the events of the past 5 or 6 years, especially, people were saying things that were practically right out of this study in the 1950s, when people say things like, well, there was a school teacher in this Italian village who said, no one really respects anyone trying to get ahead. There's a great envy of education and wealth, and everyone distrusts anyone who's ever been elected to office, and on and on. So I put this in as a challenge to people in the democracies to say, if this sounds like you, think about that. Think about how, what that means.
Let me pick up on 2 words that you've used already today: narcissism and nostalgia. And to that end, you could argue that 4 decades of narcissism and nostalgia have us focused on Ronald Reagan, for example, who famously said, government is not the solution to your problem, government is the problem. And there was also Margaret Thatcher, his contemporary from the United Kingdom, who said there's no such thing as society. There's individual men and women, and there are families. People must look after themselves first. And let me emerge with this question. Is this distrust of government and a more sort of self-interested approach to citizenship, do you think we're at the inevitable endpoint of that worldview 4 decades later?
I don't think so. And I can't speak to the Thatcher quote, but I've always thought that the Reagan quote was out of context, because to understand, I was a voter in 1980, and to understand what Reagan said in 1980, you had to have lived through the 70s. And the notion that a lot of Americans had that government simply was getting in the way of better solutions to a lot of social problems. The Reagan administration thought government could do a lot of good things, just not most of the things that it was doing by 1980. I actually identify the 1970s and the early 1970s as the starting point of a lot of this kind of cultural rot. Remember, the 70s were famously dubbed the me decade. And that once we came out of a sort of permanent youth culture after the 60s, and we monetized it, because this is, in a way, the book is a critique of capitalism as well. Once we consumerized everything, we were already on the path to ruin. I think, there's no arguing that the conservative movement definitely had an impact on the notion of, self-reliance and less involvement with government. But I still think that the original sin here is the permanent institutionalizing of a consumerist, youth-oriented culture that encouraged us to follow our every whim, to never get older, to never grow up, to never be responsible. And I think that really begins in the early 1970s. And then accelerates actually after the end of the Cold War, when we just lose any sense of seriousness about anything. In some ways, if I'm nostalgic, I'm almost nostalgic for the 1980s, because it feels like we took things, including politics, a lot more seriously than we did after 1990.
Well, let me follow up with this delicious quote from your book. You say, we can now get from hello to I hate you faster and at a greater distance than any generation of humans who have ever lived. How delighted are you with what social media have done to us?
That's a hard question to answer, because I'm part of the problem. I'm a technological optimist. I came of age when the internet did. I'm kind of a computer nerd myself. But social media has been deeply destructive in the way that we as people have used it. Again, this is a problem that requires us to look in the mirror. And part of the problem with social media is that you are really mostly rewarded for negative interactions. And for a lot of people, social media has become the equivalent of coming home and kicking the dog. That you just reach out and lash out at other human beings because it just makes you feel better about your day. And you don't really have to think about the fact that you're hurting other people's feelings or saying terrible things to other human beings. And I've been guilty of it. I get snippy with people on social media. I have a large Twitter account. But I think this is where it does dovetail. Steve, you asked me at the beginning of our discussion about the death of expertise. It's also a source of alternative, I won't even say information, of alternative views of reality, like rabbit holes that people fall into and become completely irrational about. And so you have this 1-2 punch of an encouragement to be our very worst selves anonymously from behind a keyboard and be just, horrible to other people, but also to live in worlds that aren't real and to believe in things that simply are not true. And at some point, if knowledge and virtue, as I quote the founders of the American Republic repeatedly, John Adams, James Madison, others pointed out, knowledge and virtue are the pillars of a representative democracy. And if we lose both of them, we lose everything.
We are in danger of losing those right now. I appreciate your deep concern about that. I also note, and you and I are about the same age here, we certainly never grew up with anything in government akin to a ministry of loneliness, which they have in the United Kingdom right now. There are just a lot of people out there who are feeling alone and atomized, and they don't see any particular way out of that as well. And I wonder, as you sort of add it all up, do you see a way out of all of this for us?
I hope that some of that will dissipate with the end of the pandemic. But of course, these uncivic attitudes that have especially arisen in the United States during the pandemic are keeping us locked in this kind of empty, lonely existence because we simply can't get past it. I think at this point today, we're over 700,000 deaths in the United States. But I think, again, people have to make choices. They need to step away from their computers. They need to turn off their televisions. Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute, now at the Atlantic, and a few other folks have said simple things like take a walk, go outside. And it seems like this really anodyne, condescending advice, but that is important. And I think one way to get past this, people have become obsessed with issues at the national level, particularly here in the United States, and pay almost no attention to anything happening at the local level. One cure for all of this is to know what's going on in your community. I was in a store here in Rhode Island the other day, and there were like 6 local newspapers from all the towns that surround me. And it was just it just warmed my heart, that if you really want to know what was going on in the communities along the Sakonnet River, they have a newspaper and you should read it. But instead, people want to go online and say, I'm going to solve, racial problems in the United States. I'm going to solve the deficit. I'm going to solve, these gigantic problems of social unrest. And that is, again, a narcissistic sense of heroism that tells you that simply being an involved member of your community is beneath you or not enough for you somehow. And so I would appeal to people to say, get away from this constant rush of narcissistic gratification and do some of the boring things. I spent 2.5, almost 3 years working in state and local government, and I can tell you that's where everything gets done, but it's boring. It's not as much fun as working, and I worked in the U.S. Senate. It's not as much fun as working in the Senate, but if you really want to figure out how the potholes get filled and how your garbage gets picked up, that's where it happens. And I think that's where people need to focus, and then the rest kind of solves itself over time.
I'd like to give the last word to your dad on this, who gave quite a brilliant answer, as you've described it in the book, when you asked him whether he was voting for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney. What was his answer?
Well, I have to set the stage by telling you that my father, an intelligent and well-informed but uneducated man born in the early 20th century, my dad had a lot of pretty retrograde political views. I mean, he was a bigot. He was a misogynist. He was, your typical white working class, blue collar to gray collar worker. And he was one of the Democrats. He was an FDR Democrat who left the party, the Democratic Party here in America after '68, and then became a Nixon voter and a Reagan voter and so on. And yet at the end of his life, he was in his 90s, and we were watching President Obama speak. And no matter what my father's views about race or anything else. He never spoke ill. He was old school. You didn't speak ill of the president of the United States. You just didn't. It was something you didn't do. And I said, I knew my father, was Republican. He was voting for Romney, and we were from Massachusetts. And I said, Dad, I don't think it's going to happen. I think, president's going to get reelected. And my father just nodded, and he really surprised me. He never got a chance to vote. He died just a few weeks before the election. But he said, they're both good men. We're going to be fine no matter who wins. And that really struck me. And I start the book with that story because that's where I want us to get back to, where we can look at each other and say, listen, these are good people. We're going to be fine no matter who wins. And instead of this catastrophizing where we think every election is the end of the world and we are on the side of the angels and light, and the people across from us, on our street are, the army of darkness. And I thought if my father could do it after 94 years of, being poor and being a bigoted guy and all the things my father went through, if he could sit there and look at Barack Obama and Mitt Romney and say, these are both good men, we're going to be fine. If he could do it, any of us could do it.
Amen. Great story. Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, is Tom Nichols' latest. We're so grateful, as always, you find time for us here on TVO. Tom, thanks so much for joining us, as always.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Monday, September 27th, 2021. Why are optometrists in the province not seeing children and seniors right now? Well, tomorrow we'll get you that story. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The Agenda is always on. To catch up on conversations from this week or any week, visit our website, tvo.org/theagenda, or our YouTube page at youtube.com/theagenda. It's all there for whenever you want to watch.